So good afternoon. Another great lunch. Let's take a minute and show some love to the banquet staff and the food service, because they have done a magnificent job. I think, like yesterday, we're going to be in for another outstanding afternoon. I'm going to take a minute and introduce our speaker this afternoon, Bill Eggers. So the official part is, Bill's an award-winning author and executive director of Deloitte's Public Leadership Institute. And there he's responsible for research and the thought leadership for Deloitte's public sector industry practice. And he just said that kind of worldwide, there are about 7,000 folks doing that, 7,000 or more doing that work. Or just in the US, 7,000 in the US doing that work. He's a leading authority on government reform, and he's advised government and political officials from around the world. So that's the public bio. So now we get to the behind-the-scenes bio. So I asked Bill what was on his I suck at list, and he said singing. Then I asked him what government or public official would he like to give advice to? And again, you saw immediate recognition in his eyes. Then he stopped. He thought some more. Then he said, okay, I'm going to go with Narendra Modi, who's the president of India. But I think his original thought was a little closer to home, but I don't know exactly what it was, but I think it was closer to home. Then I asked him, what would he like his last meal to be? And he said, anything my wife cooks. And his wife is here, so he got big husband points on that one. Big husband, you made a big deposit on those husband points. So let's give some applause and our attention to Bill Eggers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we're going to start off by watching a short video.
Terrible.
Okay, wait. Okay, we're going to start up one more time with the audio on. Okay, here we go.
People noticed a problem in their community. Terrible traffic congestion and emissions. 1 billion people worldwide lacking adequate housing. A desperate need for clean drinking water. So, they came up with solutions. They built dozens of ride-sharing businesses to reduce the cars on the road. A house that costs $300, and developed a water purifier that creates 1,000 potable liters a day. There was no mastermind behind this change. Instead, today change is rearing up organically. It's a growing movement, breaking across traditional sector boundaries and expanding every day. At the heart of this revolution is a new economy focused on solutions. A new cadre of problem solvers is closing the gap between what citizens need and what traditional governments can provide. They're using the principles of economics to design markets that produce not dollars, but public value. This solution economy utilizes emerging technologies, innovative business models, and impact currencies to achieve public outcomes. Like an ecosystem, the solution economy brings together a vast array of players to trade in sustainable responses. It's happening in your country, in your industry, in your community. It will disrupt old operating models, old services, and the way we think about them. Are you ready to contribute? Find out in the Solution Revolution.
Very subtle, right? So, my brothers are also writers, and but they actually write not only books, but they write screenplays, and so they get to see their names on the big screen after this. And as a writer of 9 public policy and business books, I figured that was never going to happen with me. So what you just witnessed was a book trailer, which is what I which is what I asked Harvard Business Review, my publisher, to put together so I could actually experience that myself. I want to start off by talking about the third biggest killer disease that exists, and that's malaria. Malaria kills one child every 30 seconds. It's been a plague for centuries now, and yet Bill Gates calls malaria one of the greatest opportunities the global health world has ever had. And not only that, but the Gates Foundation is putting $2 billion into this bet that we can eradicate malaria within our lifetime. So why would they be doing this, and why would he call such a plague an opportunity? Well, it turns out that we've had incredible success actually reducing deaths from malaria since 2000. Deaths in 2000 were close to 1 million a year. They're down about 47%, and it's gone down even more since then. Now, those of you that do public health issues, and that's probably most of you, that is an amazing, amazing accomplishment in a very short period of time. And again, Bill Gates believes that we're going to get to zero, essentially, within our lifetime. Now, we studied dozens of examples like malaria, big, hairy societal problems, what are often called wicked problems. And we looked at these solution ecosystems that were trying to solve those problems. And so we call this wicked opportunities because people are actually looking at the problems as opportunities to solve. And the ones that were successful and that have been successful, we found they had certain characteristics. First, a broad mix of players across a range of actors. And as I'm looking out at the boards there that you've been putting together yesterday, I saw that mix of different players. Secondly, an integrator, someone who's going to hold the space and create that aligned action. And earlier today, you talked about that in terms of integrated service delivery and potentially the schools being an integrator in health. Another one is innovation engine. And essentially, that's an engine where you're breaking constraints. You're basically looking at the current trade-offs, and you're breaking those trade-offs through innovation, enabling this sort of solutions to scale and to scale quickly. Market incentives, really important for the viability and sustainability that there's actually markets that are operating correctly in this area. And lastly, we rarely saw kind of a silver bullet solution. Instead, we saw more of a buckshot approach, a variety of different interventions to solve that problem. And for most of the successful ones we saw, they had these characteristics. So let's look at this in terms of malaria eradication, and let's unpack that a little bit. So first of all, you had a broad mix of players that have been involved in malaria eradication over the past decade. This includes government, the UN Millennial Challenge, it's a big piece of it, foundations like the Gates Foundation, many others. Hundreds of social enterprises have come in and made malaria their focus. But interestingly, a lot of big companies have also been involved. Some of these companies have donated over $150 million towards eradicating malaria. Why would they do that? Well, if you look at a Shell, a Chevron, and others, they have big presences in Africa and areas where a lot of their employees are at. You also have an integrators. It's very, very difficult for these multi-sectoral ecosystems to operate well without someone holding them together as integrators. And in this case, you had 3 different integrators, Malaria No More, Rollback Malaria, and the MDG Alliance, who are all working across those sectors, and especially helping to connect the private sector to social enterprises to nonprofits within this ecosystem. You also had a portfolio of interventions. And in this case, there was vouchers for low-income people, social marketing campaigns. They teamed up with literally thousands and thousands of local businesses, essentially, as their kind of business storefronts in the villages throughout Africa. And there's lots of partnerships. Then you had an innovation engine, and this became really, really important. So one of them was mosquito nets, low-cost mosquito nets, which we've heard about, very effective. But the real big one was low-cost rapid diagnostic testing. They came up with a way of essentially, for 50 cents each, testing people to 99% accuracy in terms of having malaria. That enabled hundreds of millions of people to be tested who previously were not tested. Now, the key to the innovations coming forward was that through the money from governments, foundations, and others, they created a viable market, okay, a viable market for those innovations to emerge because it became a multi-billion-dollar market. And so the malaria ecosystem had all of these elements, and they're all operating well. So now what I'd like to do is kind of go through those in a way. Now, this is not isolated by any means. When you look at, this is anti-human trafficking, and human trafficking, one of the really, really big problems throughout the world. And there's an ecosystem that's part of the trafficking, but a very, very, growing ecosystem has emerged actually to fight the human traffickers. And it involves corporations, a lot of nonprofits, and other sort of things, governments too, because this is an area government can't solve alone, because most of the problems are actually happening in the private sector, whether it's hospitality, manufacturing, and other areas. We're also seeing this in water and wash. And essentially, this is where you've emerged a pretty sophisticated system which looks at investors. You've got investors who are investing in eliminating some of the water problems. You've got a lot of companies who are engaging in collective action to deal with water, and that includes companies like Pepsi, CocaCola, Procter & Gamble, Nestle. You've got water tech incubators and hubs who are actually trying to create the space for those innovations to emerge. We've studied dozens and dozens of these ecosystems, and they all tend to look a little bit like this. So let's unpack this, and let's go through some of the individual areas. So a broad range of players operating. One of the things that the book looked at was this notion of wave makers. And these are essentially organizations or individuals that are revolutionizing how we approach society's biggest problems. And one of the big things is that typically 15 years ago, for most of these problems, there was two entities looking at it. It was governments and nonprofits. Today, the landscape for organizations that are approaching societal problems has absolutely exploded. And so within these wave makers, you have social investors and impact investors, which has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. You have citizen change makers. You have a lot of multinational, multirationals. And what that means is double and triple bottom line companies right now who basically are trying to solve big problems and at the same time earn a profit. But if you add all of this up, it means that governments and nonprofits are no longer kind of on their own trying to tackle these problems. There's a whole other wave of organizations, and it's not only in the US, it's all over the world. And what's interesting is that some of the really most interesting things are happening in places like East Africa and India and others where you've had some government and market failure occurring, and you've had a lot of entities who have come into that gap. So let's look at it in terms of in terms of a problem that you talked about yesterday, which is the opioids epidemic. So we've done is we've looked at this from an ecosystem perspective too. I mean, this is a huge problem, probably one of the biggest public health problems in America today. You look at that statistic, we have less than 5% of the world's population, yet we consume 80% of the global opioid supply. And where I live in the Northeast and a lot of the New England states, this is the biggest issue right now for governors today. And you've heard about the statistics. It is awful. And it has an impact on all aspects of society. Child welfare systems, mental health systems, workforce systems, criminal justice, workers' compensation, public health. This is not a problem that can be approached in isolation by any means. It actually takes getting a lot of these entities working together in various respects. And this is just on one side, because then if you look in the private sector between the pharmaceutical companies and doctors and hospitals and so forth, then that adds a whole other element of complexity to it. And so in this case, when you're looking at this, and I'm going to go back to opioids as we go through other things, you have to, it's a multi-stakeholder approach. You have to get the incentives right, say what are the innovations that we're going to do, and figure out how to get all these entities to be working together in a much more sophisticated way than they are today. So innovation engine. This is a really, really critical element of making these solution ecosystems actually work. You want an innovation that's going to kind of cut through and find new ways of doing things. So let's go back to clean water. 1 billion people around the world today lack access to clean water. That's more than 1 in 9 people. Now, this individual, Dean Kamen, has come up with what he believes is an answer to the clean water issue. Now, Dean Kamen is the inventor of what? Anyone? Segway. The Segway and hundreds of other inventions. He's literally one of the leading inventors in the world. So here's the situation. And back when he came up with the slingshot water purifier, my company, Deloitte, we were actually helping him kind of build the business plan, look at the strategy around it. And at the time, then, the idea was that people are going to be fighting over this. But he went to the UN, not interested. Went to the World Bank, not interested. Went to lots of countries, not interested. Went to foundations, not interested. So here you have this world-famous inventor who's figured out a way to deal with a scarcity issue cheaply, yet no one seemed to be interested in actually helping him to scale it. So then he had to think differently. He had to change his lens and say, okay, who is in every village in Africa and India and everything who has an interest in clean water who can actually help me distribute these? And it suddenly came to him. Who do you think? Any guesses? Yes, someone said it over there. CocaCola. CocaCola has a huge Clean Water for Africa campaign. It's one of their biggest issues, not only from a corporate social responsibility, but shared value perspective. They can't grow without clean water, and water is one of the biggest ingredients in Coke. So they formed a partnership, and they started putting these slingshot purifiers in these kiosks all throughout about dozens of different countries. And what happened was they found mutual advantage in that. And that's really a key thing. I did notice on the boards when you were looking at who are partners, there wasn't a lot of talk about different companies. But what I want to emphasize to you today is that there's been a massive, massive movement in terms of companies in trying to solve societal problems, and a big movement towards shared value. And if you look at this, just some examples in the health arena and others, you've got P&G in partnership with UNICEF is hoping to literally wipe out tetanus in Africa. Warby Parker and Marc Jacobs have partnered with Vision Spring to bring eyeglasses to 563 million individuals. One of the most famous examples is Project Shakti in India, where basically they've employed not only 45,000 women in India to help with hygiene and sanitation, but they became the integrator, actually going into all of these villages and actually teaching people how to wash their hands, teaching kids and so forth, working in hospitals, and also then trying to expand their product. So it's really, really key to look for, because what companies can do, they know how to scale. Companies are really, really good at scaling fast, but the key thing is you have to find that mutual advantage and where their interests are. Another thing when we talk about innovation is what we're seeing a lot of within kind of the social impact area is innovation in business models. And that can be a key thing. Again, if you think about innovation as breaking trade-offs, right? So these are some hospitals in India. I think some of the most interesting healthcare innovations are occurring in India today. Why? Because they're with over 1 billion people, and a fairly poor country, they can't afford the Western model. They cannot afford the expensive Western model, so they've had to find new models. So this hospital, Narayana Hospitals, they perform more heart surgeries each year than just about anyone. About 15,000 cardiac surgeries in 2015. Now, the price is only about $2,000 per. Typical US hospital, $20,000 to $10,000. 100,000. Now you must say then, well, the quality must not be as good, right? It must be poor quality. Actually, the quality is pretty good. 1.4% versus 1.9% mortality rate. So how did they do this? They did it through business model innovation. What they said is that, many hospitals are trying to do so many different things, right? And they spend a lot of money on administrative processes and everything. They're some of the most complex institutions known to mankind. So what we're going to do is we're going to create models where all we do is one thing. All we do is cardiac surgeries, or all we do is cataract surgeries on eyes. And they were able to then get the costs way, way down because they're performing it on a repeatable basis. We see the same thing with LifeSpring Maternity. $80 for delivery, more than 30% lower than market rates would be, because that's all they do is deliveries. One of the most famous examples is Aravind Eye Hospital. They perform 300,000 operations a year, $25 for basic surgery versus $1,650. The average eye doctor there does about 1,000 of these a year, but they've been able to get that process down in a way that's very difficult to do if you're doing thousands of different things. So think about that innovation. The last thing I want to say is that when you look at, let's go back to the opioids epidemic, and how do you drive innovation? How can governments or foundations, investors actually try to create that environment? Well, we're seeing a lot of interesting things going on. Prizes and challenges, challenge.gov, or essentially the federal government has done over 600 prizes and challenges for all sorts of things, just saying, we're going to put this out there and we're going to try to get innovation through kind of a prize that might be anywhere from $200 to $25 million, as we see with some of the X prizes. Pay for success initiatives, where governments are increasingly saying, we're going to work with foundations, we're going to work with impact investors, and we're going to try to come up with evidence-based solutions by paying for success. Another one is just advanced analytics. We're going to go through an example later on, but really amazing things. So you can use these tools to try to create that environment and drive those innovations that way. Now let's look at the next area, which involves kind of a portfolio of interventions. And this is, again, the same notion that you're not going to be able to have one silver bullet for anything. And that absolutely applies right now in the space of opioids. So here you're seeing states and counties, foundations experimenting with a lot of different sort of solutions. Here you've got several states have taken steps to limit first-time prescriptions of opioids. In New Jersey, doctors are trying alternatives to it. You've got a lot of states, Tennessee right now, that they're trying to stop using opioids altogether in terms of pain relief. And so what we can do is then judge which ones of these are working and then switch around, move quickly. I also like the ability to what analytics can do. So as I mentioned, the private sector and others are going to play an important role here. And on the front lines of this are a lot of the kind of workers' compensation companies. And they can actually start seeing these patterns. And in this case, one of the companies they were able to identify very early warning signs of opioid usage that were occurring by looking at a variety of these different sort of data sources right now, coming them together and saying, these patterns are showing us that this is going to lead to very excessive opioid usage, and how do we cut that off early on? So again, a portfolio of interventions. Now let's look at the next area, which is market incentives. And I want to look at another big problem in our society, and that's food waste. 40% of the food in the US is wasted annually. That's $140 billion worth of waste. I think kind of we're at the stage today of food waste where we were with the environment back in the 1970s, where people were finally kind of waking up to just the massive amount of waste in our system here, and it being, in fact, a moral issue in many respects. So how did previous generations try to deal with this issue of food waste? My generation, my parents' generation. Well, let me show you a video which kind of reflects the model that was used then. So if we could tee up the audio back there. Okay.
Their food thoroughly. And they eat all of their food. Sally and Jim are good members of the Clean Plate Club. Yes, Mr. Brown is a member too. He's president of the Clean Plate Club at the Brown's house.
Well, not so sophisticated an approach, and that, of course, did have slight unintended consequences, which is rising obesity in our country. So, and that's another issue that we're not going to talk about today, but also can be solved through this ecosystem approach. So what about today? How are social entrepreneurs, nonprofits, governments, companies trying to address the problem? It's absolutely fascinating, actually. There's an entire economy that has emerged around reducing food waste. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So you've got a variety of organizations trying to essentially reduce food waste at the prevention piece, saying it's occurring in the farms, it's occurring in manufacturing and other areas. How do we go upstream, way upstream, to reduce food waste? One of these companies is called Lean Path. And Lean Path may actually be used here. And Lean Path is really interesting. So this is how it works. They'll go into hotels, they go into conference centers, universities, and they'll put scales, essentially, they'll put scales in the kitchen. And when you're buying too much food and then you have to throw it out, it goes on the scale. It goes on the scale, so they're measuring it all the time. They're measuring which food is wasting and so forth. And then they're looking at that against hundreds and hundreds of other entities and against what you've done before. And then they help you to actually buy better and waste a lot less upstream. There's a lot of other innovations there. But they make money doing this, selling this service to universities and others. Why? Because you can save money, right, if you're not buying so much food to begin with. So in this case, they saved more than $300,000 for Amherst, 124 tons of food scraps. So let's look at another one. So then you go there, and then there's food rescue. This is a really interesting area. We've got a lot of the essentially food kitchens involved and others, but one of the things we know is that whether it's in grocery stores where the sell-by dates are pretty conservative, oftentimes that food is still good, or an entity like this which is going to throw out a lot of food that's perfectly good, but there's no mechanism to connect that. Friends of mine, they went to MIT for business school. They're Deloitte consultants, and they got really into this area, and they started up a social enterprise called Spoiler Alert, a startup. And what it does is it's created an eBay to connect those with food that's going to go to waste with food kitchens, nonprofits, and other entities that need the food. And it's a real-time sort of mechanism for connecting those two. They've now scaled it to a variety of different states and local governments, and they're dealing with that. Now, another thing that I mentioned is like grocery stores. So a lot of the food gets wasted. It's in grocery stores because of mispackaging and other things, perfectly fine food. So what have they done in Europe? They've created something called social supermarkets. And those are essentially where the food's going to be 80–90% reduced price, and it's available for low-income people who can go and shop there, and so they've created specialized supermarkets there. The person who started up Trader Joe's is actually started something like that in Boston, so we're starting to see that coming. And then you go through, and there's food recovery and transformation, there's food recycling. Campbell's Soup Company has basically zero waste right now, zero waste through this sort of a system. But why I bring this up is it's so interesting because 25 years ago, we would have chosen very different models. But $140 billion in waste means that's a $140 billion economic opportunity for entities. And so thinking about these market incentives is really key. Let me end by talking about ecosystem integrators. And this is such an important role, and a role that I know a lot of your organizations play, and I would encourage more of you to play this role. Because today, what we lack is we lack organizations that can be colliders of people, not atoms, can provide platforms for problem solving, can coordinate all of these interventions. You have to have these sort of integrators to make these ecosystems work. An ecosystem integrator can set broader ambitions, diversify risk, bring people together, enable innovation, become a market primer, do so many different things. And the key thing is you want these integrators to be there in the long run. In the case of malaria, some of those organizations have been there for 10 years, and they say we're going to be there another 10 years. It's not a temporary thing. It's people who understand the systems. And some of the literature here was talk about a systems approach. These are all about a systems approach and people who understand that entity. So we've actually developed, with the Rockefeller Foundation, a whole guide for investors and funders called Engage, which is about how you can support these ecosystems. Very, very detailed playbooks and everything. It's a big website. You can find it right here. And I'd say it's just really, really terrific, really aimed for people at the community level who are trying to make this happen. Let me end by talking about one other, I think, really big issue, big societal problem. That's honeybee extinction. Now, how many of you knew that honeybees are in danger of being extinct throughout much of America and Europe? Okay, it's a huge problem. How do you fix a problem like that? Are you going to create a department of honeybee survival, right? Are we going to hire, millions of government beekeepers? No, probably not. I mean, it's a problem, but without people looking at a certain solution, and it's not an institutional solution. Maybe what you do is you find a social entrepreneur, an integrator who wants to solve that problem. Someone like Oliver Maxwell. Now, Oliver is a Brit who was living in Copenhagen, and he was just driving around the city, and he saw a beekeeper. And he's like, wow, I don't see beekeepers very often. And he started talking to the beekeeper, and the beekeeper was telling him that, well, I'm getting older, and so are other beekeepers. There's no one following us up, and bees are going to be extinct very soon in Copenhagen if something's not done. And no one's really focused on this. And Oliver said, I don't know anything about bees, but I do know about social entrepreneurialism, and I'm going to try to take this on. And one of the things he wanted to do was connect, and how do we get a lot more beekeepers? So what he did was he created a social enterprise called BB. And this social enterprise essentially was going to try to solve this problem. And what Oliver found was this. He said all of the pieces were there in trying to solve this problem, but no one had put them all together before. So what did he do? So he went first and he said, okay, we need rooftops to actually put the beehives on. So he went to different businesses and he said, will you donate your rooftops to us? And in exchange, you can have your own branded honey, right? And so in Copenhagen, we actually have a bunch of, we have Deloitte honey that you can get a hold of. And a lot of businesses were on board with that. So he gets the rooftops. And he's going to, he's donating the beehives and so forth. But then he said, well, we need someone, where are we going to get the workforce? I've got to find dozens, if not hundreds, of people who want to be beekeepers. So we went to the organizations that work with people who are out of work, unemployed, homeless, and so forth. And he said, can we source people from you? They said, absolutely. He went to the beekeeping workforce. He said, would you train them? Absolutely that they would. And he went to the housing associations. He went to a lot of city leaders, and he said, can you give us some money to get started and some space? Absolutely. One guy with a vision who didn't know anything about it, who could integrate this ecosystem, was able to address this problem and really fix it. He fixed it in the city. He took a very, very sticky problem there, and he was able to fix. That's our Deloitte honey. And I think it just shows that, you don't have to run a giant foundation. You don't have to head a government department. You don't have to be the head of corporate social responsibility for a company or anything to play a big role in this sort of thing, and to be one of these integrators and to be part of the solution here today. All you need is that will and passion and vision to make a difference and to be someone who can bring all these entities together. Thank you so much.